Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he walked through the crowded halls of Nexus Station. The massive alien trading post buzzed with activity as creatures from dozens of worlds conducted their business. Strange smells filled the air and alien voices echoed off the metal walls. Jake had been living on this station for 6 months now and still felt amazed by the sight of so many different species working together. He carried a datapad in his hand that contained the final details of humanity's first major trade agreement with the Vorthak Consortium. After months of careful negotiations, Jake was proud of what they had accomplished. The humans would share their advanced medical technology in exchange for faster-than-light engines that could change everything for Earth's expanding colonies. Jake, wait up, called a familiar voice from behind him. Lisa Grant jogged to catch up with her friend. She wore the blue uniform of station security, and her hand rested casually on her weapon. Lisa had been Jake's closest friend since they arrived at Nexus Station together. She was tough, smart, and always watched his back during the tricky political games that happened on the station. "How are you feeling about today?" Lisa asked as they walked toward the diplomatic section. "This is the big day, right?" Jake nodded and smiled. "Chen Wei says everything is ready. The Vorthak have agreed to all our terms, and we should be signing the final papers in a few hours. Earth is going to be so proud when they hear what we accomplished here." Lisa looked around nervously at the alien traders and diplomats walking past them. "I still don't trust those bug creatures. The Vorthak give me bad feelings whenever I see them. Their eyes never stop moving and they whisper to each other in their clicking language when they think we can't see them." "You worry too much." Jake laughed. "Ambassador Chen Wei has been working with them for months. He knows what he's doing. Besides, Commander Rick Hayes checked all the security arrangements himself. Nothing can go wrong today." They reached the human diplomatic quarters and Jake felt a surge of pride as he saw the Earth flag hanging next to flags from a dozen other worlds. Humans had come so far in just a few decades since making first contact. Now they were about to become major players in galactic trade and politics. Ambassador Chen Wei stood in the main conference room talking quietly with Commander Hayes. Chen Wei was a tall, thin man with gray hair and sharp eyes. He had been a diplomat for over 20 years and everyone respected his experience. When he saw Jake approaching, he smiled warmly. "Jake, my friend," Chen Wei said, shaking his hand. "Are you ready to make history today? This agreement will change everything for humanity. Our children will look back on this day as the moment we truly joined the galactic community." Commander Hayes stepped forward. He was a military man with broad shoulders and a serious expression. "The security arrangements are all in place. My people have checked every corridor and room 3 times. The Vorthak delegation will arrive in 1 hour and we'll be ready for them." Jake felt excited as he reviewed the final documents one more time. The medical technology they were sharing would help countless alien species fight diseases that had plagued them for centuries. In return, the faster-than-light engines would let human ships travel between star systems in days instead of months. It was a fair trade that would benefit everyone. The Vorthak delegation arrived exactly on time. Zephyr Kolthak led the group of 3 insect-like aliens into the conference room. Each Vorthak stood about 7 feet tall with 4 arms and large multifaceted eyes. Their chittering language sounded like dozens of clicking sounds mixed together. Jake had learned enough of their speech to understand basic words, but Chen Wei handled most of the complex talking. "Honored humans," Zephyr clicked in heavily accented English. "We are pleased to complete this agreement today. The Vorthak Consortium values partnership with your young but impressive species." The ceremony proceeded smoothly as both sides read through the final terms and signed the digital contracts. Jake felt proud as he watched Chen Wei shake hands with Zephyr, using the formal diplomatic greeting they had practiced. Everything was going perfectly according to plan. Then the first explosion shook the station. Emergency lights flashed red and alarms began wailing throughout the diplomatic section. Jake grabbed onto the conference table as the floor trembled beneath his feet. Through the large viewing window, he could see fires burning in the human residential quarters. "What's happening?" Jake shouted over the noise. Commander Hayes was already on his communication device calling for damage reports. The Vorthak delegation clustered together, chittering rapidly in their own language. A second explosion rocked the station even harder. Lisa burst into the conference room with her weapon drawn and her face pale with shock. "Jake, the human quarters are under attack. Someone planted bombs in the life support systems. We have casualties and the fire suppression isn't working properly." Chen Wei stepped forward with a grim expression. "Commander Hayes, secure the diplomatic section immediately." We need to protect our guests until we know what's going on. Jake felt confused and frightened as station security officers poured into the room. Something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't understand what was happening. The trade agreement had been going so well. Who would want to attack the human delegation now? Jake Morrison, called a loud voice from the doorway. Station Security Chief Vextar entered the room with 6 armed officers behind him. The reptilian alien scales were dark green, and his yellow eyes focused directly on Jake. You are under arrest for terrorism and sabotage against Nexus Station. What? Jake stepped backward in shock. That's impossible. I've been here in this room the whole time. Check the security recordings. Vextar held up a data crystal that glowed with recorded information. We have evidence that you planted explosive devices in the human residential section, using your engineering access codes. The devices were designed to look like accidents, but our investigation found your digital signature on the sabotage programs. Jake looked around the room desperately. Lisa had her hand on her weapon, but she was outnumbered 6-1. Commander Hayes looked stunned and confused. Chen Wei stood with his mouth open as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. This is a mistake, Jake said as the security officers moved closer. I would never hurt my own people. Someone must have stolen my access codes or forged the evidence. Please just check the security cameras. They'll show I've been in diplomatic meetings all day. Zephyr Kolthak clicked rapidly to his companions, then turned to address the room. The Vorthak Consortium is shocked by these terrorist actions. We came here in good faith to make peace with humanity, but it appears some humans prefer violence to diplomacy. Chen Wei stepped forward with tears in his eyes. I'm so sorry this happened. Jake Morrison does not represent humanity's true values. We completely reject terrorism and violence. The Earth government will investigate this situation thoroughly. Jake felt the world spinning around him as the security officers grabbed his arms. Everything was happening too fast. The trade agreement was ruined. His friends were dead or injured, and somehow everyone believed he was responsible for the attacks. As they dragged him from the conference room, Jake caught Chen Wei's eye for just a moment. What he saw there made his blood run cold. Instead of confusion or sadness, he saw something else entirely. Chen Wei looked satisfied, almost pleased with how events were unfolding. The security officers hauled Jake through corridors filled with smoke and emergency teams rushing to help the wounded. Through broken windows, he could see the human residential section burning. Lisa was probably in there somewhere along with dozens of other humans who had trusted him to keep them safe. They brought him to a holding cell deep in the station's security section. As the door slammed shut, Jake slumped against the wall and tried to understand what had happened. Someone had betrayed him and destroyed everything he had worked for. But who could have done such a thing and why? Hours later, Vextar returned with official documents. Jake Morrison, you have been found guilty of terrorism against Nexus Station. By order of the Station Council, you are sentenced to permanent exile in Sector 0. May whatever gods you believe in have mercy on your soul. As they led him toward the abandoned lower levels of the station, Jake realized the truth. He had been set up perfectly. Someone had wanted the trade agreement to fail and needed a human scapegoat to take the blame. But the real question was whether they had succeeded in destroying humanity's future in the stars, or if somehow Jake could find a way to fight back from the depths of the forgotten sectors below. The elevator that took Jake down to Sector 0 made strange grinding noises as it descended into the forgotten parts of Nexus Station. The security officers who escorted him wore breathing masks and carried extra oxygen tanks. One of them explained that life support in the lower sectors was unreliable and dangerous. This is where the station dumps its garbage and its mistakes, the officer said as the elevator shuddered to a stop. Nobody comes down here unless they have to. The forgotten ones who live here are mostly crazy or dangerous or both. The doors opened to reveal a dimly lit corridor that smelled like rust and decay. Broken pipes dripped strange-colored liquids onto the metal floor. The gravity felt wrong, somehow lighter in some places and heavier in others, as if the generators were failing randomly. Emergency lights flickered on and off, casting moving shadows on the walls. Jake stepped out of the elevator and immediately felt the doors slam shut behind him. The sound of the elevator rising back toward the civilized levels echoed through the empty corridors, until it faded away completely. He was alone now in a place that felt more like a tomb than part of a space station. He walked slowly down the main corridor trying to get his bearings. Signs on the walls were written in dozens of different alien languages, but most were too faded or damaged to read clearly. Doorways led off into smaller passages that disappeared into darkness. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of machinery working poorly, and voices speaking in whispers. A shadow moved behind him, and Jake spun around quickly. A small creature emerged from a hidden alcove in the wall. It stood about 4 feet tall with large wings and compound eyes like a moth. Its gray fur was patchy and dirty, but its movements were quick and precise. "New arrival?" the creature chirped in accented English. "Not many humans come down to Sector 0. You must have made someone very angry up there." Jake nodded carefully. "I'm Jake Morrison. I was framed for terrorism and exiled here." The moth creature tilted its head curiously. "I am called Pip by the others here. I know these tunnels better than anyone. If you want to survive your first week, you should listen to what I tell you." Pip led Jake deeper into the sector, past rusted doors and broken viewing windows. They walked through areas where the ceiling had partially collapsed and other places where strange plants grew from cracks in the walls. The air grew thicker and harder to breathe as they moved away from the main corridors. "Rule 1, Pip explained as they walked. "Stay away from the red zones where radiation leaks from the old reactors. Rule 2, trust nobody completely but make allies quickly or you will die alone. Rule 3, never go to the deep tunnels where the station's waste systems dump toxic materials." They reached a large open area that had once been a cargo bay. Now it served as a gathering place for the exiled inhabitants of Sector 0. Jake saw aliens from species he had never encountered before, along with a few humans who looked like they had been living rough for years. A massive bear-like creature approached them with heavy footsteps. It stood nearly 8 feet tall with thick brown fur and intelligent dark eyes. Despite its intimidating size, the creature moved carefully and spoke in a surprisingly gentle voice. "Another human joins our little community," the creature rumbled. "I am Gorvak of the Urson Collective. What brings you to our forgotten corner of the galaxy?" Jake explained his situation, while other inhabitants of Sector 0 gathered around to listen. He told them about the trade negotiations, the bombing of the human quarters, and his conviction for terrorism. Some of the listeners nodded knowingly, as if they had heard similar stories before. An older human man stepped forward from the crowd. He had gray hair and wore a dirty medical coat that had seen better days. "I'm Doc Reeves," he said, shaking Jake's hand. "I've been down here for 2 years since they decided my medical license wasn't valid for treating alien patients. Welcome to the club of people who know too much or ask too many questions." A human woman with short red hair and scars on her arms joined the conversation. "Kara Stone," she introduced herself. "Former smuggler turned permanent resident of this lovely establishment. The station authorities caught me moving medical supplies to colonies that couldn't afford to pay the official prices." Jake felt overwhelmed by meeting so many people who had been cast aside by the system above. Each person had a story of injustice or persecution that led them to this forgotten place. But despite their circumstances, they seemed to have formed a community of sorts that helped each other survive. Pip chirped excitedly and pulled out a small device that looked like a portable computer. "I have been collecting information about what happens on the upper levels," the moth creature explained. "My people are naturally good at getting into small spaces, and I know how to access the station's old security networks." The device displayed grainy video footage from the human residential quarters during the bombing. Jake watched in horror as he saw Lisa Grant trying to evacuate civilians when the second explosion collapsed part of the corridor. The recording was too damaged to show what happened to her after that. "There's more," Pip said, scrolling through files. "I found communications between the Vorthak delegation and Ambassador Chen Wei from before the trade negotiations started. They were planning something together, but the files are encrypted." Gorvak growled deep in his throat. "The Vorthak are known for their deception throughout this part of the galaxy. They have destroyed the economies of 3 different species by making trade agreements that favored only themselves." Doc Reeves leaned closer to examine the recordings. "If you were framed, then someone wanted you out of the way for a specific reason. The question is what they hope to accomplish by destroying the human trade delegation." Kara crossed her arms and looked thoughtful. "Chen Wei probably made a side deal with the Vorthak that benefited him personally. Humans are new to galactic politics, which makes them easy targets for more experienced species." Jake felt anger building inside him as the pieces of the puzzle began forming a picture. "So Chen Wei betrayed his own species for personal gain and used me as a scapegoat to cover his tracks." "That would be my guess." Doc Reeves nodded. The real question is what we can do about it from down here in the forgotten sectors. Pip's compound eyes glittered with excitement. I know every maintenance tunnel and service corridor in this station. If we work together, we might be able to gather enough evidence to prove what really happened. Gorvak stood up to his full, impressive height. The Urson Collective teaches that justice delayed is justice denied. If these humans were betrayed by one of their own, then honor demands we help them seek the truth. Jake looked around at the group of exiles who were offering to help him despite barely knowing him. These people had been cast aside by the same system that had betrayed him. They understood what it felt like to be abandoned and forgotten. What you're suggesting sounds dangerous, Jake said. If we're caught investigating the upper levels, they'll probably execute us instead of just keeping us exiled down here. Kara laughed grimly. We're already dead as far as the station is concerned. The only difference is whether we die as victims or as people who fought back against injustice. Doc Reeves pulled out a medical scanner and began checking Jake's vital signs. You're malnourished and dehydrated, but otherwise healthy. If you're going to survive down here, you'll need to get stronger both physically and mentally. Over the following days, Jake began learning how to live in Sector 0. Gorvak taught him basic self-defense and how to move quietly through the maze of corridors. Kara showed him where to find clean water and edible food among the supplies that were smuggled down from the upper levels. Pip introduced him to the complex network of service tunnels that connected every part of the station. The moth creature could squeeze through spaces that larger beings couldn't access and had mapped out routes that avoided security sensors and patrol areas. Doc Reeves helped Jake understand the political situation on Nexus Station. The different alien species were constantly competing for advantage, and humans were seen as naive newcomers who could be easily manipulated. The Vorthak Consortium controls about 30% of the trade that flows through this station, Doc explained one evening. If they can get exclusive access to human medical technology, they'll have a major advantage over their competitors. Jake spent his nights staring at the dim ceiling of his small sleeping alcove and thinking about Lisa Grant and the other humans who had died in the bombing. Their deaths were his responsibility, even though he hadn't planted the bombs. He had trusted Chen Wei, and that trust had gotten his friends killed. But now he had new allies who understood what it meant to be betrayed by the system. Together they might be able to find a way to expose the truth and get justice for the people who had died. It wouldn't bring Lisa back, but it might prevent other innocent people from suffering the same fate. As Jake drifted off to sleep, he made a silent promise to his dead friend. Somehow he would find a way to make Chen Wei and the Vorthak pay for what they had done. The forgotten people of Sector 0 had given him hope, and now it was time to turn that hope into action. 3 weeks after arriving in Sector 0, Jake had learned to navigate the dangerous maze of forgotten corridors like a native. His hands were calloused from working with broken machinery, and his body had grown lean and strong from the constant physical challenges of life in the depths. More importantly, his mind had sharpened as he adapted to thinking like a survivor instead of a diplomat. Pip scurried through a narrow ventilation shaft above the main gathering area where Jake waited with the others. The moth creature's ability to access the station's information networks had become invaluable for their growing resistance movement. Today, Pip carried news that would change everything they thought they knew about the conspiracy. I found something big, Pip chirped excitedly as it dropped down from the ceiling. Chen Wei is coming back to Nexus Station in 6 weeks for a special ceremony. The station council wants to honor him for protecting the galaxy from human terrorism. Gorvak's growl echoed through the chamber. While the real terrorist enjoys praise and rewards the innocent suffer in exile. This injustice cannot be allowed to continue. Jake felt his jaw clench with anger, but he forced himself to think strategically. If Chen Wei is coming back, that gives us an opportunity to expose him publicly. But we'll need solid evidence that proves he was working with the Vorthak from the beginning. Doc Reeves pulled out his medical scanner and began running diagnostics on some equipment they had salvaged from the upper levels. Evidence won't matter if we can't get it to the right people. The station council already believes Chen Wei is a hero, and humans are dangerous terrorists. Kara stood up and began pacing around the small space. We need to recruit more people who have reasons to hate the current system. There are others on this station who know the truth but are too scared to speak up. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Pip, can you access personnel records for station employees who were demoted or transferred after the bombing? Someone up there must have asked the wrong questions or seen something they weren't supposed to see. Over the next several days, they identified potential allies among the station's workforce. Tony Blake had been the head of maintenance until he was exiled for questioning why the explosive devices hadn't triggered the station's automatic safety systems. Nina Cross was a former communications officer who had been transferred to waste management after intercepting suspicious transmissions between the Vorthak and unknown parties. The most interesting recruit was someone Pippi discovered in the station's artificial intelligence records. Zara 9 was a synthetic being from the Collective who had been marked for deletion after accessing classified files about the bombing. She was hiding somewhere in the abandoned sectors, avoiding the security sweeps that were hunting for her. Finding a synthetic ally could change everything, Doc Reeves explained as they planned their recruitment strategy. Artificial beings can process information faster than organic minds, and they have different ways of accessing computer systems. Jake and Kara volunteered to make contact with Tony Blake, who was living in a different section of the Forgotten Levels. They traveled through maintenance tunnels that Pippi had mapped out carefully, avoiding the areas where security sensors might still be active. They found Tony working on a water reclamation system that served the lower sectors. He was a stocky man with graying hair and permanent grease stains on his coveralls. When he saw them approaching, he grabbed a plasma torch as a weapon. "Stay back," Tony called out. "I don't want any trouble with scavengers or gang members." Jake raised his hands peacefully. "We're not here to rob you, Tony. My name is Jake Morrison, and we want to talk about what really happened during the bombing of the human quarters." Tony's eyes widened with recognition. "You're the terrorist they blamed for the attack. Why should I trust anything you say?" Kara stepped forward and showed Tony a small device that Pip had given them. It contained copies of the suspicious communications that had been intercepted before the bombing. "Because we have proof that the official story is a lie." After reviewing the evidence, Tony agreed to join their growing resistance movement. His knowledge of the station's infrastructure would be crucial for any operation they attempted in the upper levels. He also confirmed their suspicions about the bombing itself. The explosive devices were placed in locations that would cause maximum damage to the human quarters while leaving the diplomatic areas mostly intact, Tony explained. Someone with detailed knowledge of the station's layout planned those attacks very carefully. Their next recruit was Nina Cross, who they found working in the waste processing center deep in the station's lower levels. She was a thin woman with short black hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to notice everything around. Her Nina had been monitoring communications, traffic on the day of the bombing, and remembered seeing encrypted messages between Ambassador Chen Wei and external parties. The messages had been deleted from the official records, but she had made personal copies before being transferred away from her position. Knew something was wrong when they ordered me to stop investigating those transmissions, Nina told them as they met in a hidden alcove near the waste processing facility. Chen Wei was definitely communicating with someone outside the station, but the encryption was too advanced for me to break. The most difficult recruitment was Zara 9, who had been successfully avoiding detection for weeks. Pip finally located her hiding in a section of the station that had been abandoned for decades. The synthetic being appeared human except for the faint blue glow in her eyes and the perfect symmetry of her facial features. "Why should I trust organic beings when your own species betrayed you?" Zara 9 asked when they first made contact. "My kind are considered property by most governments in this galaxy." Jake spent hours talking with the artificial being about justice and the importance of fighting against oppression, regardless of whether you were organic or synthetic. Eventually, Zara 9 agreed to help them, but only if they promised to support synthetic rights in whatever new system emerged from their actions. With their team assembled, they began gathering resources for their mission. Kara's smuggling contacts provided them with basic weapons and communication equipment. Tony's engineering skills helped them modify salvage technology for their specific needs. Nina worked on decrypting the communications she had intercepted, while Zara 9 began probing the station's computer networks for additional information. The breakthrough came when Zara 9 successfully accessed Chen Wei's personal files from his previous visit to the station. Hidden among diplomatic documents were detailed plans for sharing human medical technology with the Vorthak in exchange for personal wealth and political power. Chen Wei wasn't just betraying the trade negotiations, Zara 9 explained as she displayed the stolen files. He was planning to sell exclusive rights to human medical advances to the Vorthak, who intended to use them as biological weapons against other species. Jake felt sick as he read through the documents. The conspiracy was even worse than they had imagined. Chen Wei hadn't just sacrificed the human delegation for personal gain. He had potentially doomed entire alien civilizations to biological warfare. Doc Reeves studied the medical information that Chen Wei had been prepared to share. Some of these techniques could be modified to create targeted diseases that would affect specific alien physiologies. The Vorthak could wipe out their competitors without firing a single shot. Gorvak's massive hands clenched into fists. This is not just betrayal of humans. This threatens every species that opposes Vorthak expansion. We must warn the other governments before it's too late. They began planning their operation to expose the conspiracy during Chen Wei's upcoming visit. The plan had three main objectives. First, they needed to gather enough evidence to prove Chen Wei's guilt beyond any doubt. Second, they had to find a way to broadcast that evidence to the entire station where representatives from dozens of worlds could see it. Third, they needed to ensure that Chen Wei and his Vorthak allies faced justice for their crimes. Jake realized that success would require him to become someone completely different from the diplomatic engineer he had been before. The naive young man who had trusted authority figures and believed in fair negotiations was gone forever. In his place was emerging a hardened leader who understood that sometimes justice required fighting dirty against enemies who had no honor. As they finalized their preparations, Jake looked around at the diverse group of allies who had joined their cause. Humans and aliens working together, synthetic and organic beings united by their shared commitment to stopping a conspiracy that threatened the entire galaxy. It was exactly the kind of cooperation that diplomatic negotiations were supposed to create, but it had taken betrayal and exile to make it happen. The forgotten people of Sector Zero were about to remind the galaxy that some things were too important to be left to politicians and bureaucrats. Chen Wei thought he had destroyed Jake Morrison and buried the truth in the depths of the station. Soon he would learn that some truths refuse to stay buried and some people are much harder to destroy than they appear. The day of Chen Wei's arrival brought unusual activity to the upper levels of Nexus Station. Jake watched through a hidden camera feed as diplomatic vessels from across the galaxy docked at the station's main ports. Representatives from dozens of worlds had come to witness the ceremony honoring the human ambassador who had supposedly saved them from terrorist attacks. Jake crouched in a maintenance tunnel 2 levels below the diplomatic quarter with his team spread throughout the station's infrastructure. Months of careful planning had led to this moment when they would finally expose the truth about the conspiracy. Each team member had specific objectives that needed to be completed within a narrow time window. Zara 9's voice crackled through their improvised communication system. I'm in position near the main computer core. Security protocols are active, but I can bypass them when you give the signal. Tony Blake reported from his position near the power distribution center. All systems are running normally. I can redirect power to our equipment when needed without triggering automatic alarms. Nina Cross had infiltrated the communication array using her old access codes that hadn't been completely deactivated. Broadcasting equipment is ready. I can override the station's normal programming and send our evidence to every screen and speaker on Nexus Station. Kara Stone was positioned near Chen Wei's temporary quarters, where she hoped to find additional physical evidence of his crimes. The ambassador's security detail is lighter than expected. Most of the station's resources are focused on protecting the ceremony itself. Pip had mapped out escape routes through service corridors that would allow the team to retreat if their operation was discovered. Doc Reeves and Gorvak were standing by to provide medical support and muscle if things went wrong. Jake checked his watch and activated his communication device. This is it, everyone. Chen Wei's transport docked 15 minutes ago, and he should be in his quarters preparing for the ceremony. We have maybe 2 hours before the event starts. The plan began smoothly as each team member moved toward their objectives. Jake himself headed for the Vorthak research facility that Pip had discovered in a restricted section of the station. Intelligence gathered over the past weeks suggested that the biological weapons research was being conducted there under heavy security. Jake crawled through ventilation shafts that were barely wide enough for a human body. Pip had assured him that this route would avoid most security sensors, but the confined space made him feel claustrophobic. Every few minutes he had to stop and listen for signs that his movement had been detected. The research facility was protected by multiple layers of security, including automated defense systems and Vorthak guards. Jake used equipment that Zara 9 had modified to hack the door controls while staying hidden in the overhead maintenance area. Inside the facility, Jake found laboratories filled with equipment he didn't recognize and biological samples from dozens of different species. Computer terminals displayed research data about genetic vulnerabilities and targeted disease vectors. The scope of the biological weapons program was even larger than they had suspected. Jake began downloading files to portable storage devices while photographing the physical evidence. The research showed that the Vorthak had been planning to use human medical knowledge to create diseases that would specifically target their political and economic rivals. Meanwhile, Kara's infiltration of Chen Wei's quarters revealed additional proof of the conspiracy. She found encrypted communication devices and financial records showing payments from Vorthak accounts to Chen Wei's personal holdings. There were also detailed plans for expanding the biological weapons program once the Vorthak gained exclusive access to human medical technology. The first sign of trouble came when Zara 9 detected unusual activity in the station's security networks. Someone is running active scans for unauthorized access attempts. They might have detected our presence. Jake's heart raced as he finished copying the research data. How long before they trace us back to our positions? Maybe 10 minutes if we're lucky, Zara 9 replied. The security algorithms are more sophisticated than I expected. Jake made a decision that would change everything. Instead of retreating quietly, he activated the research facility's emergency protocols, which sent automatic alerts throughout the station. If they were going to be discovered anyway, he wanted to create as much chaos as possible. Alarms began wailing in the research facility as automated systems detected the unauthorized access. Emergency lights flashed red and security doors slammed shut throughout the restricted area. Jake found himself trapped inside the laboratory with Vorthak guards rushing toward his position. Nina, we need that broadcast right now. Jake called through his communication device as he looked for another way out of the facility. Nina's voice was tense with concentration. I'm fighting their jamming systems, but I can get through. Broadcasting in 30 seconds. Throughout Nexus Station, screens flickered and changed from their normal programming to display the evidence that Jake's team had gathered. Diplomatic quarters viewing areas and public spaces suddenly showed recordings of Chen Wei discussing his betrayal of humanity with Vorthak conspirators. The biological weapons research data appeared on screens across the station, revealing the Vorthak plan to use human medical knowledge for genocide against their rivals. Financial records proved that Chen Wei had been paid millions of credits for his cooperation in the conspiracy. Jake heard explosions in the corridor outside the research facility as station security forces tried to breach the emergency lockdown. He climbed onto a laboratory table and began forcing open an overhead maintenance hatch while Vorthak guards pounded on the sealed doors. The reaction to Nina's broadcast was immediate and dramatic. Throughout the station, representatives from dozens of worlds watched in horror as they learned how close they had come to being victims of biological warfare. Species that had been preparing to honor Chen Wei suddenly realized they had been celebrating their own potential destroyer. Zephyr. Kolthak appeared in the research facility just as Jake managed to escape through the ceiling. The Vorthak leader had used his security clearance to bypass the emergency lockdown and now stood among the exposed biological weapons equipment. Clever little human. Zephyr clicked in his chittering language. But you are too late to stop what has already begun. The research is complete and the weapons are ready for deployment. Jake paused in the maintenance tunnel above the laboratory. Your conspiracy is exposed to the entire galaxy. No species will trust the Vorthak consortium after today. Zephyr's compound eyes glittered with malice. Truth is irrelevant when superior force can impose a new reality. The Vorthak fleet will arrive within hours to secure this station and continue our expansion. The conversation was interrupted by new explosions that shook the entire station. Jake realized that the Vorthak were already implementing their backup plan by using military force to maintain control despite their exposed conspiracy. Tony Blake's voice crackled through the communication system. Jake, the power grid is under attack. Someone is trying to overload the main reactors. If they succeed, they'll destroy the evidence and everyone on the station. Jake made another split-second decision and dropped back down into the research facility. If the Vorthak were willing to destroy Nexus Station to cover their crimes, then he needed to make sure the biological weapons research was eliminated first. Zephyr chittered in surprise as Jake landed behind him. "You should have escaped while you had the chance, human." The fight that followed was brief but vicious. Zephyr had 4 arms and natural armor, but Jake had spent months learning to survive in the harsh environment of Sector 0. More importantly, Jake was fighting for justice while Zephyr was defending a conspiracy based on genocide and betrayal. Jake managed to activate the laboratory's sterilization protocols, which would destroy all the biological samples and research data. As purification flames began consuming the facility, Zephyr made one last desperate attack, but Jake rolled away and the Vorthak leader was caught. In his own burning research, the laboratory's destruction sent shockwaves throughout the station as automated systems detected the loss of critical biological containment. Emergency evacuation protocols activated in the restricted sections while security forces tried to maintain order among panicking diplomatic delegations. Jake escaped through maintenance tunnels as the research facility burned behind him. The biological weapons program was destroyed, but the larger conspiracy still needed to be stopped. Chen Wei was probably trying to escape while Vorthak military forces approached to secure the station by force. As Jake rejoined his team in the lower levels, he realized that their success had created an even more dangerous situation. The conspiracy was exposed, but now they faced a direct military assault by enemies who had nothing left to lose. The forgotten people of Sector 0 had struck back against injustice, but the real battle was just beginning. Chen Wei's betrayal had brought the galaxy to the edge of war, and now humanity's fate would be decided by whether they could unite their former enemies against a common threat. The first Vorthak warships appeared on Nexus Station's long-range sensors 6 hours after Jake's team exposed the conspiracy. Emergency broadcasts throughout the galaxy had alerted every major government to the biological weapons plot, but military response would take days to organize. The station's inhabitants faced the immediate prospect of battle, with only their own resources for defense. Jake stood in the station's command center surrounded by alien diplomats who hours earlier had been preparing to honor Chen Wei as a hero. Now they looked to Jake for leadership despite the fact that he was officially a convicted terrorist. The irony wasn't lost on him, but there wasn't time to appreciate it fully. Station Commander Veltar spread his 4 arms over the tactical display, showing incoming Vorthak vessels. The reptilian officer had spent his career maintaining neutrality between competing species, but the conspiracy evidence had shattered any pretense of diplomatic balance. 12 heavy cruisers and 4 battleships, Veltar reported grimly. "Our defensive platforms can hold them off for maybe 2 hours before they overwhelm our shields." Ambassador Yixhai from the Crystalline Collective stepped forward with light patterns dancing across her translucent skin. The Vorthak gambled everything on keeping their conspiracy secret. Now they must capture or destroy this station to prevent the truth from spreading further. Jake studied the tactical display while his mind raced through possibilities. What if we don't try to fight them off? What if we make them come to us on our terms? Doc Reeves looked confused. Jake, this isn't Sector 0 where you can hide in maintenance tunnels. This is open space combat against a superior force. Jake smiled grimly as a plan began forming in his mind. No, but this is still Nexus Station, which means we know every corridor and system better than they do. Tony, can you overload specific sections of the power grid without destroying the whole station? Tony Blake nodded slowly. I can create electromagnetic pulses that would disable electronics in targeted areas, but it would also knock out our own systems in those sections. Zara 9's synthetic mind processed the tactical situation faster than organic intelligence could follow. You want to let them board the station, then trap them in sections where their technology won't function properly. Jake pointed to areas on the station schematic. The Vorthak depend on advanced equipment and coordinated communication. If we can force them into close combat in confined spaces where those advantages don't matter, then we might have a chance. Kara laughed, despite the desperate situation. You want to turn the entire station into Sector 0, where the Forgotten Ones have all the advantages? The plan that emerged over the next hour was unlike anything in standard military doctrine. Instead of trying to prevent the Vorthak from boarding, Jake proposed to let them capture specific sections of the station, then systematically isolate and neutralize the invading forces. Pip volunteered to coordinate movement through the maintenance tunnels that connected every part of the station. Nina Cross would control communications and jam Vorthak signals while directing their own forces. Gorvak would lead the close combat. Teams that would engage enemy troops in the confined spaces where Vorthak advantages would be minimized. The battle began when Vorthak boarding pods breached the station's outer hull in 3 different locations. Jake watched from the command center as enemy troops poured into the diplomatic quarter and began advancing toward critical systems. "Now, Tony," Jake called out as the first wave of Vorthak soldiers reached predetermined positions. Electromagnetic pulses knocked out power in entire sections of the station, plunging the advancing troops into darkness, while disabling their communication and targeting systems. Emergency lighting provided minimal visibility, but the Vorthak found themselves fighting blind in unfamiliar territory. Gorvak's team struck from maintenance tunnels and service corridors, using weapons that didn't depend on advanced electronics. The massive Urson warrior led charges through darkened corridors, where his physical strength and natural night vision gave him decisive advantages over disoriented Vorthak troops. Jake himself led a team through the areas where he had lived as an exile. The forgotten sectors that had taught him to survive now became a maze of death traps for invading forces. Pip guided them through routes that avoided the main fighting while positioning them to strike at Vorthak command posts. The battle raged. For hours as both sides adapted to the unusual conditions. The Vorthak began using flamethrowers and explosive charges to clear blocked corridors, while Jake's forces responded with hit-and-run tactics that exploited their superior knowledge of the station's layout. The turning point came when Zara 9 successfully hacked into the command systems of a captured Vorthak cruiser. She used the ship's own weapons to attack its sister vessels while broadcasting surrender demands in the Vorthak language. "Attention, Vorthak fleet." Zara 9's artificial voice echoed through space on all communication frequencies. "Your conspiracy has failed and your invasion force is trapped aboard Nexus Station. Surrender now or face complete destruction." Jake found himself in a final confrontation with Chen Wei in the human diplomatic quarters, where the conspiracy had begun months earlier. The ambassador had been trying to reach an escape pod when Jake cornered him in the same conference room where they had signed the original trade agreement. "You destroyed everything we worked for," Chen Wei said as he backed toward the viewing window. "Humans could have been partners with the most powerful species in the galaxy." Jake stepped closer with Gorvak flanking him on one side and Kara on the other. "You would have made us accomplices to genocide for the sake of your personal profit." Chen Wei pulled out a small device that looked like a communicator. "The Vorthak aren't finished yet. Even if this station falls, they have other plans that will ensure human cooperation." The device was actually a dead man switch connected to explosives hidden throughout the station. If Chen Wei was killed or captured, the bombs would destroy critical life support systems and kill thousands of innocent beings. Jake realized that his enemy had planned for this moment just as carefully as he had planned the original conspiracy. Chen Wei was prepared to commit mass murder to avoid facing justice for his crimes. "You're bluffing," Kara said, but her hand moved instinctively toward her weapon. Chen Wei smiled coldly. "Am I? The Vorthak taught me that dead heroes are more valuable than living prisoners." The standoff was broken when Pip dropped from a ceiling vent and landed on Chen Wei's shoulders. The small moth creature's quick movements caught the ambassador off guard, and he dropped the dead man's switch as he tried to shake off his attacker. Jake dove forward and caught the device before it could hit the floor and trigger the explosives. For a moment he held the lives of everyone on the station in his hands while Chen Wei struggled with Pip and reached for a backup detonator. Gorvak ended the threat with one powerful swipe of his clawed hand. Chen Wei collapsed and the conspiracy that had cost so many lives finally died with its architect. The Vorthak fleet surrendered within hours as word of their defeat spread throughout the galaxy. Without their biological weapons program, and with their conspiracy exposed, they faced unified opposition from dozens of species who had nearly become victims of genocide. Jake stood in the station's main assembly hall 6 months later, as representatives from across the galaxy formally established new treaties, that would prevent similar conspiracies in the future. He wore the blue uniform of station security, but carried the authority of someone who had proven that justice could triumph over betrayal. The forgotten people of Sector Zero had been relocated to proper quarters throughout the station. Pip had been appointed as head of information security, while Tony Blake supervised a complete overhaul of the station's infrastructure. Doc Reeves established a medical center that served beings from all species without discrimination. Zara 9 had become an advocate for synthetic rights throughout the galaxy, while Nina Cross directed a new communication network that ensured transparency in interspecies negotiations. Kara Stone used her smuggling experience to establish legitimate trade routes that brought prosperity to previously isolated colonies. Gorvak served as Jake's chief of security, but spent most of his time training new officers in the techniques they had developed during the battle for Nexus Station. The massive warrior had found peace in protecting others, rather than fighting for the political interests of his home government. Jake himself had been offered positions with Earth's diplomatic corps and several alien governments, but he chose to remain on Nexus Station. His experience in Sector Zero had taught him that the most important work happened among the forgotten, and discarded rather than in the halls of official power. The memorial wall in the main assembly hall displayed the names of everyone who had died because of the Vorthak conspiracy. Lisa Grant's name was engraved in letters that caught the light from the viewing ports where ships from dozens of worlds docked peacefully. Jake visited the memorial every day to remind himself why the work mattered. The conspiracy had been defeated and justice had been served, but new threats would always emerge from the ambitions of those who valued power over principle.